Hello, good afternoon. My name's Marianne Williams. I'm a specialist gastroenterology community dietitian working for Somerset Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. This is the second episode in our series of how to run a webinar for patients. And in this episode, we're going to concentrate on what webinar service you should use. This is a relatively short webinar, just giving you the main tips of what you need to look out for from a webinar company. We use GoToWebinar Pro service. And with that comes a free access to GoToMeeting. GoToMeeting is incredibly useful. It's like another version of Skype, but even better. And you can share your screens, etc. So very useful facility that comes free with GoToWebinar. But there are lots of alternatives out there, lots of different companies, all of which you can compare very readily next to GoToWebinar. So there's no particular one company that we would definitely recommend. It just happens that we use GoToWebinar Pro service. What are the important points for you to remember with the webinar service? Whichever one you choose, these are the important points you need to remember. So the reliability of that webinar service is really, really important. I found different webinars that I've attended for other reasons, not ones we've set up, and it's taken me 20 minutes to try and get on, and then it's crashed, etc. You really need a very good, reliable system. I would really look up the reviews on different webinar companies and see what's going to suit you best. Don't always base it on cost, and I would definitely not go for the free versions. Even as a practice, the free versions will give you an unrealistic idea of the reliability and how that webinar service will perform on the day if you've got a proper full subscription. I really wouldn't recommend going for the free services. I really don't think that'll help you make a decision. They must be easy and logical for healthcare professionals to set up the actual webinar. So you need to go into the webinar program and set up each webinar individually, and it needs to be really user-friendly from your point of view. And really important, it has to be easy for the patients to use. This is absolutely imperative. If it's not easy for the patients to use, you will not get the patients attending the webinars. If they have to think, they will not use the webinar. It has to be really simple for them to use. We get 96% of people saying they would recommend our webinars to friends, and I think it's over 80% that are finding the webinars really easy to join. So it is very important that you use a good webinar service. The webinar service must be compatible with multiple browsers, because bear in mind that your patients might be using Safari, which comes with Macs, or Firefox, or Internet Explorer, or Google Chrome, or many others out there. But those four main browsers, it's really, really important that your webinar service is compatible with those. Otherwise, again, you will find that patients can't access your webinar and become frustrated. It's got to be compatible with multiple operating systems. So obviously the vast majority of people have Microsoft, but some people have Linux, and then of course a lot of people increasingly have Apple. So it must be compatible with Macs as well. It must support access via not only your PC, but also through tablets and mobile phones. Increasingly, people are accessing webinars or videos or YouTube simply through their mobile phone. And the mobile phone screens are getting so large now that, quite frankly, it's very easy to see. So whatever webinar company you choose must support access through multiple devices. Very easy for the attendee to use and quick to set up. Attendee can easily register for the online webinar. So when the attendee sends us an email saying we'd like to register, that registration link that we send them must be super easy for the patient to register with. Again, they don't need to have to think. So not only with registering must it be easy, but as I was saying just now, it must be very easy when they actually log on to attend the webinar. There is an automatic attendee reminder system for upcoming webinars. So if they've registered for a webinar that's live, they will constantly get reminders that the webinar is coming. I think they get one a week before, a day before, and an hour before the webinar starts. If it's an on-demand webinar, so one you've pre-recorded and you're just putting out there, much in the same way as we ran this session as a webinar, there's no need for any reminders. But having that reminder facility can be incredibly useful if you're running a live webinar. Automatic integration with the attendee calendar. So if you're running a live webinar and they need to know when the webinar is going to start and what day it's going to be on, you just click a button and it will automatically put it in their calendar. That is a very useful facility. So in the first 6 to 8 months when we were running webinars, we were running them every third Monday at 7 o'clock. So we needed to make sure that our attendees who'd registered all through the month were constantly reminded that that webinar was coming up right until an hour before the webinar. Otherwise, people simply forget and then don't attend on the night. Allow audience participation. So whatever webinar company you choose, it needs to give you the facility to have handouts uploaded onto the webinar so that the patients can download whatever handouts they want. It needs to give you the facility to run polls during the webinar so that you can check people are understanding your presentation as you go along. It needs to give you the facility for patients to ask questions. Now, with GoToWebinar, you can turn this off and on because there are some cases when having the ability to ask questions is not appropriate and some cases when it is. So you can turn that off and on depending what you want. But you need to have a service that gives you that option, that patients could type in a question during a webinar, or when they're watching it on demand, they could still type in a question and a little pop-up box will come up in an on-demand webinar saying, thank you for your question. Your question will be answered in, and you can put 24, 48 hours, 7 days, whatever suits you best. But you do need a webinar service that gives you that option. The other important point to remember is the audio quality. How good is the webinar company's audio quality? How good are they at recording your audio quality? In episode 3, I go through what microphones to use to record your webinar, but what you really need to know is when the webinar company are saving that recording, is the audio quality good at their end as well? So that when you send that webinar out for people to listen to, they're going to be able to hear it clearly. There's nothing more frustrating than having bad audio quality when you're trying to listen to a webinar or a podcast or a video. So this is really important. Recording of the webinar automatically sent to attendees. So with GoToWebinar, I'm sure with lots of other webinar services, when the webinar has finished and they've turned it off, they will automatically be sent an email 24 hours later with a copy of the recording so that they can re-watch it as often as they wish. And that's really, really important, that the webinar company will automatically send a copy of the recording to their attendees. The webinar company will store every recording you've made, and then you can choose a recording to use as an on-demand webinar at a later date. So that's very important. They have that facility to keep a record of all your webinars so that you can then use them as on-demand webinars later on if you think that's appropriate. Automatic post-webinar emails for outcome data. So a lot of webinar companies will have automatic surveys they send out, but what they also do is have these automatic emails that go out that I said will have the copy of the recording attached. Our webinar, post-webinar email that the company sends out, we've set so that it will give the link to the next webinar as well as links to the survey for them to fill out after the webinar. So it's really important that you can manipulate that email to contain the information you want it to contain. You don't want a webinar company that's just sending out a standard email that you can't change the text on. So it's really important that they will send out those post-webinar emails, but that you can alter the text and the content of those emails. So choosing a webinar service is just about getting the right service for you and get going. Start making webinars. Just make sure that you choose the right webinar company for you and get going. So what next? What I would suggest would be really useful now is to watch episode 3, which is setting up your first webinar. That is a longer webinar. It goes on for about 40 minutes, but it gives you lots and lots of tips that, quite frankly, I wish we'd had when we first started doing webinars 18 months ago. I hope you found this short webinar useful in what to look out for in a webinar company, and I wish you lots of luck and hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.